Welcome, everyone, to the February 2022 textual Bible study on Bible and Beyond discussions. I'm your host, Shirley Paulson, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Hal Taussig. Tonight, we have part 4 of the 4-part series discussing the book, After Jesus, Before Christianity. We'll talk about the conclusions of the book, which include some major themes, such as the fact that there was no nascent singularity called Christianity, the influence of the empire, new experiments in community life, and the importance of shared meals. I do want to mention before we turn this over to Hal that we encourage and appreciate an ongoing pledge of support via Patreon. We do need your help to keep on going. So if you're not a member yet, please go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to make a monthly pledge that's just right for you. PayPal or checks are also an option if you prefer. Thanks so much, and we're eager to get going here. Hal, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Shirley. Since this is the first the last time with the book on After Jesus, Before Christianity, I want to take a little bit of a moment to notice where we are for this coming hour. So for me, the previous 3 times have gone by like a flash. You had specific topics for the previous 3, but it felt to me as I was preparing for tonight that we had lots more to say. And again, here we'll probably be leaving us short in terms of how much we can get through. But I do want to say a little bit of focus on Shirley. So in the last about month and a half, Shirley has had 10 programs on this book. Not just this space, but a lot more. And it's been very powerful for me to be in on those with your leadership, Shirley. And I'm very grateful for your incisive both to think about this book and the character of it, and to also think about the way larger groups can think through the questions and thoughts that the book poses.
Hal,
I would say also, go ahead.
I just want to thank you for saying so, and I just want to thank you, Hal, for the leadership that you brought to this whole seminar that happened for 10 years or so with Westar, because I think that the things that you brought and that you brought out in the podcast that you shared with some of us helped us to see a great deal of depth and breadth for what you brought, and brought other colleagues together so that we could all think and learn together. So kudos and many, many thanks to you, Hal.
Thank you. I did notice as we prepared for tonight, I couldn't quite figure out how many programs I have been in on since early November, but I think it's around 22. And so I'm, and it's been a really stunning set of differences into who I've been talking to, along with my 2 other primary writer colleagues. So this week there will be 4 additional times that I meet with people around the country. I'm also was very moved by the fact that one of our major moments that we had with another group with Brendan Scott and Erin Vearncombe was a large group of people in Israel. And so it was very stunning to see how, and this was a wonderful Jewish organization that asked us to talk about the book. And what they noticed was that the book itself, although basically written by a bunch of Christians, sounded quite different than Christians. And they were especially noticing that the book basically points toward the first 2 centuries, in which almost everybody that was related to a Jesus group was also related to the people of Israel. Not necessarily because they had their mom and dad as people of Israel, but because when people came into contact with Jesus groups, they basically began to think of themselves as as people of Israel themselves. So lots of different things going on. Next week, we have a couple of really wonderful evangelical groups that are thinking about the book together. We've had several what they call deconstructed evangelical groups that are still evangelicals, but thinking differently than they had before. So we are really learning more and more. It feels to me like I only knew half of what I did just 2 months ago. So finally, in terms of what we are doing tonight, as I said before, for those of you who have been here before in the previous 3, I worry that I have not done justice to you, giving you enough time to think through what you want to think through about the book or about the conversations. So I want to underline that again tonight, that I am going to stand back a little bit. I have things to say, but I want to stand back and make sure that you have thoughts and questions, protests and the like, for where you are now in these 4 times that we've gotten together. So I think I will actually start there. And that would be then to say right off the bat, are there things that you have that you want to ask harder questions about, that you want to clarify questions, or for me, more important yet, are there things that are coming into focus for you about what you think of those first 200 years of the Jesus groups? So again, if you don't have it right offhand and need a little bit of a wait, that's fine, because I can easily jump into the conclusion of the book, chapter 20. But for a moment, I'm going to just be quiet and see if, as you think out loud, there's something that's on your mind that we can start with.
You know, Helen, I don't want to put you on the spot, so you may or may not want to answer this question yourself. But
I've been put on the spot a lot.
Yeah, well, I'm putting Helen on the spot right now because she raised a question during one of the discussions we had among the Patreon group that had these discussions, and she asked a question that I think I've heard it permeating in several places. Well, the thing that I heard Helen asking, which I thought was a really good question, was, so we've heard lots of reasons as to why there are lots of different groups of people, and then the Jesus followers were kind of small within the context of the whole Roman community. But what was it that made them keep going? There wasn't a church, there wasn't a creed, there wasn't a Bible. What was there that moved them to keep going and become more coalesced as became later Christians in early years?
Perfect question for us, and I would answer, I think, on 2 levels at least. One is they are going in different directions. So to in that way, I want to say the people is not the conglomerate that one can think about, is a bunch of different people going different directions. And I'm going to in a few minutes, talk directly at what all of those different groups had in common, because I think that there is a very strong and easy answer on that front. Um, uh, so similarly, I guess I want to say is they aren't interested in being together as Jesus groups. They're too small, and they, by and large, don't think of Christianity the way I think of Christianity now. That is a big bunch of people who like to be in very close contact with one another in terms of what people believe and what people practice. It doesn't seem that it doesn't seem that these groups had enough time to ask the question about what about a big group? Mainly because it seems mostly that each of the smaller groups are very satisfied with what's happening in them. And I think probably rather than wait any longer, let me begin with that. And this can help us remember what we've been doing for the last 4 months. The main thing that we need to remember, first of all, is that these people are in really horrible situations. They're scared, they're hurting, a number of them are dying. Most of the families are being broken apart. Many of the people that used to live in neighborhoods don't anymore because of the danger and the violence by the Roman Empire. That's what Rome wants to do. They want to have people afraid. And so, in other words, if you ask what are they doing together, there are a couple of things to say about that. But the two things probably, first of all, are to be safe and to have some connection of wholeness to somebody. In other words, in this setting, Rome is trying to break everybody apart. And so what is going on in these quite small groups all over the Mediterranean is simply having a chance to be halfway not scared to death. And secondly, time to actually be together, just to be together. Not because you believe the same thing, not because you're a family of regular type. So these folks are saying, and the thing is, you can read this in the New Testament and the other texts beyond the New Testament all over the place. They keep saying, isn't it great we love one another? Isn't it great that we have a community? Over and over again. Paul, who writes the most letters, is over and over again saying, take time to be together. And he's very short on what one might believe, and mostly talking over and over again. Look at 1 Corinthians 13, if you would, about how much love means to this. And this is not our kind of love. It's not our kind of love, so where we can take a long time to take long walks with several friends every week. Simply not possible in that way. So that's the first thing, is safety and refuge are the two things that bring people together. We're going to talk quite a bit more about the specifics of how then that being together really brings them into an intimacy with one another. The other thing to say is that, as I said, the second time of our meeting, you have to count that every family in the empire, meaning a larger family, let's say a group of 6 or 7 brothers and sisters who live in the same neighborhood. If you count those kind of families, you have to know that almost every one of those relatively medium-sized families in their neighborhood, at least one has been crucified. Not because they're Christians, because there aren't any yet, but because Rome wants to have every village having people afraid when the soldiers walk through their village, that somebody's just going to be on the kind of wish that the soldiers have in mind, that they'll just crucify someone for the hell of it. So that is very important, why you want to be together with someone who takes care of you and who will be able to talk with you about what you're worried about and what you love. Okay, I went on and on. I'm sorry. Let's see if there's some other questions before we go to the next stage of this or go in another direction.
We do have Margie's hand is up, so go ahead, Margie.
Hal, I certainly agree with what you said about, as a possibility about those early movements. I felt like, actually, I was going to respond to Helen's question way back when, and it's still sitting in my drafts. Sorry about that. And I may have this wrong, Helen. I thought you kind of said, what about the elephant in the room? Maybe that was just my interpretation. But I feel like you aren't going back far enough, Hal. Because yes, these people gathered, but why did they gather? And I just, I feel it was the healing that was happening, and it was the resurrection. Because you look at Jesus' disciples, at least as they are portrayed in our New Testament, they were kind of dense a lot of the time. And right after the crucifixion, they were terrified. And yet it wasn't long before they're standing up in the temple, standing up to the Sanhedrin and praying to be bold. I don't think people shift like that unless something really dramatic has happened. So, I'm personally a believer that the resurrection actually happened and not that somebody stole the body away. So, that explanation makes sense to me. And I had a little trouble. I think somebody spoke on the last segment. Well, maybe it was the second one, because I think I was at the one last month, who described healing as somehow becoming aware of being part of a oneness. Like it really didn't mean what it said. But when Jesus healed the man in the synagogue that had a withered hand, the Bible says it became the same as the other. So that's not some kind of nebulous recognizing your oneness. That's real healing. And Lazarus being raised. So I guess unless one takes a position that these things were just narratives that were intended to teach a purpose, which I think is probably the case with Daniel and Job and, lots of things in the Bible. To me, the explanation is that the things that the Bible says in the New Testament really happened. Now, not the parables, and maybe not everything, but I can't fathom going from the terror. I mean, you think about Peter, who promised that he would die with Jesus, and then he denied him 3 times. He was a scared guy. And how did he suddenly become bold if there wasn't something truly dramatic? Yes, they'd seen all the healings, but they still didn't get what Jesus was trying to say. So anyway, that's my thought on that.
Great stuff, Margie.
Maybe Helen wants to say more about what she meant by her question.
But great stuff. If I may just comment briefly, because I think that what you've said is right on the money, and that in this particular way, that the primary thing that is talked about in the texts of both the New Testament and beyond is being lost, being hurt, and being afraid. And by and large, you're right that that is something that changes for them. I can't say too much about how quickly fear comes again for societies like that, because that's what the people that are in charge of it want them to. And they, as we said before, 2 weeks ago, 1 million crucifixions would be underestimating. And so now let's get quickly to the resurrection itself also. Resurrection in the New Testament is stunningly collective. That is, it's not just about one person being resurrected. It's about many people being resurrected, not only when they're dead, but because when they're really afraid. So the way you focus that, I think, is very clear that these people are just, we can't say much, we can't pick a better day than today when we look at the war and watch those people and how afraid they are. This is a war mentality of back then. So so I would want to say this. The other thing, and we've said this briefly, but I will want to say it again. So crucifixion is probably the biggest story in the Bible. And that's because that comes at them so often. And so what happens there is that when those stories get told, the other people, and this is really so close to what you're saying, Margie, is so many people that aren't a part of these little groups are having their friends and family being killed. So they hear those stories and they know. So as I said before, in the first week, it's really important that a whole bunch of people realize that these people are standing up despite the fact that people keep getting killed. And the resurrection is not at all an understated thing in the text. And they don't make the difference between when you die and when you're scared to death. And clearly, Paul keeps saying over and over again, you all little people in your little groups, you are being resurrected.
So Hal, you've raised a lot of questions now with this. And in the chat, we have a question from Carla Valance, who says, did Hal say there were many resurrections from crucifixions or just many resurrections?
Oh, That's a really important thing. No, I did not mean to say people somehow took people down from crucifixions and somehow they were still alive. That was really easy to kill people with crucifixions. What I meant to say is that crucifixions were coming at everybody all the time. And one of the things that the early groups say is that they're scared to death then, and they know that they know people who've died in that regard. And what happens to them is they affirm both: if they get killed, they will live, and if they don't get killed, they will live in a new way.
So resurrection then refers to living in a new way. Is that?
Well, not just that. They don't make the difference between. They don't do what the moderns do in this regard. They combine what it means to have new life again just because you didn't get killed, and new life when you did.
And we have a question or a hand up anyway with Lisa. You can go ahead.
Yeah, Shirley, I'm probably not as informed as most of the rest of the people on the call, but I keep getting this feeling that it's almost like this book, which I have hesitated to read because these meetings I've attended are so confusing to me. I mean, it's almost like there's like this hidden thing that isn't being said, but it really feels awkward, to have letters to the 12 churches and then to be wondering how those letters to 12 churches jives with this book. Like, in these 200 years, did the resurrection and all the healing work and everything just disappear, and then somehow in the 3rd century it reappeared? I mean, what is this book's purpose in the lexicon of Christian theology? What is it trying to show, if anything? Is it trying to upend the entire New Testament and say that it was all concocted in like the 3rd or 4th? And again, I'm sorry to be ignorant, but I don't really want to read the book and be disturbed that every time I read the New Testament, I'm going to be questioning, the total Christianity based on this book. I appreciate the scholarship, but I kind of need some dot to be connected here.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking as we were going along through the 3 weeks, is not enough time. I think I'll just say what I said before is, no, the resurrection and the crucifixion were at the heart of the experience of the first 2 centuries. Because it was so dangerous. So no, nobody's waiting to the 3rd century. The heart of all of these stories are about dying and not dying by a whole bunch of people, and being in small communities where they got together for refuge and safety. And that included all of these stories about resurrection and crucifixion. So I would say, if you read closely in the text of the Bible, you'll find that over and over again. It's not like later Christianity, which didn't have such big things to fear, but these folks really took it on straightforwardly and were saying to one another, isn't it great that we're loving one another, that God is with us in real ways? And you don't find them say, oh, I hope nobody dies. Basically, they know that people are dying all the time. Okay, so I think I repeated myself well enough there.
Well, and we have hands up with David Curtis. Okay, do you want to go ahead, David?
All right, yeah, Hal, this situation that you're speaking to of everyone being frightened after the death of Jesus and everyone being worried for themselves about being resurrected is very much spoken to in the Gospel of Mary.
Mhm.
And the answer that's given there is grace and praise. And I'm wondering if as to how to cope with the fear of being frightened of being crucified. Do those two themes come up in other places as a solution?
I would want to say they're all over the place,
Yeah.
and both inside the New Testament and beyond it. And what the Gospel of Mary says, for instance, is Jesus will be a shelter to you even after he's left. And the problem is, of course, that the leaders of that group are, as soon as Jesus leaves, they start crying and they say, if they killed him, well, they will kill us. Mary stands up in the middle of that group and says, don't you remember what he said? And then says, he will be a shelter to you, and you will go out and give this same good news.
And we have a comment here from, it looks like Anita. The idea of being resurrected from fear resonates with the transgender experience. I would also think that it would be in line with the experience of the Black community in the face of Jim Crow and the KKK in the post-Reconstruction period of the US.
Yes, that's the fascinating thing, that there are communities in our day that have similar, very scary lives. And yes, you're right. There are people who regularly claim these texts from the first 2 centuries because they read them and see how this is a life or death situation that comes to the folks every day. And yes, so I myself have been a pastor of a primarily African American congregation, and I learned a lot from exactly those kinds of things that happen in situations where so much tyranny and fright is around. Well, I'm so excited that we're getting more back and forth, Shirley. So I do have a couple of other things to say, but let's see if we've got some more right now. Well, let me say a few next things that are important. One of the first thing that we alluded to, I think, in every one of our times, and that is there was one thing that all of these groups did together. This, as far as we can tell, is the only thing they did together, and that was have dinner together regularly. And this is not the detail in the New Testament is so beautifully clear, and that is that these dinners aren't like our dinners. They go on for at least 3 hours with lots of talk, lots of singing, a fair amount of drinking, and in some of the places, hardly any food because they're pretty hungry. But they keep coming. And the amounts of those kinds of groups like it. So just to let you know, we have so many. If you go to the Near East or the Mediterranean, you can see what dining rooms look like. They're probably about 10 feet by 10 feet, maybe a little bit bigger sometimes. But this means these groups that Paul says, for instance, he's going to all of the time, there are people kind of piled on top of each other, because the houses are really small and people are fairly poor and people are fairly afraid. So it turns out that, again, here, what I want to say is the shelter and the safety is the primary experience of these people because they are so frightened. And it's not because they are scared, it's because it is scary.
Hal?
Yes, hey, Ellen.
Hello there, Hal.
Ellen.
So if I'm understanding right, it's about shelter and safety, but how is that different from other associations in the ancient world that also gather together? I get the feeling that this conviction of the resurrection is really important because they all are very familiar with the crucifixion part of it because they're afraid of their own fate, but also, but the resurrection gives them a sense of conviction, whether it's a literal or it's a vision, because that comes in both ways in antiquity, in ancient Christianity, but there is a sense that there is a conviction, a spirituality, for lack of a better word, because that definition of that word is pretty nebulous. But I'm trying to put my finger on how they're different from other associations other associations people also gather together for solidarity, for safety, for meals. But there must have been something that was unique and special about them that had to do with the Christ story.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yes, of course, the Christ story is him walking around in the scary stuff. Yeah, that's all the time, and it didn't work out well a bunch of the time for him. So yes, and your other question is so cool, Helen. I guess I have to say, I would assume that a lot of groups like that, whether they are Christ people or not, is working the same way. Why would one want to think it wasn't? In other words, it's quite clear that when you read the New Testament, they weren't interested in religion. They were interested in being close to one another and being safe as they could be. So for instance,
but in the name of Christ, right?
Sometimes and sometimes not.
So if not, then what makes them anything different than, a Mithra cult or something else?
Well, why would one needs to be if both of them are getting what they want?
I'm just trying to figure out how that evolved ultimately into an identity as a Christian. I have an anthropologist daughter, and I wrote this in the Shirley's Google Doc thing, and she and I had these great discussions about religion and spirituality, but she is not religious. And as an anthropologist, she sees everything as a matter of function, that people are religious today because it functions in a certain particular way that has more of a social need, instead of, so there's no God in that picture. You see what I mean? And what I'm trying to do is to figure out why these groups had such strong conviction, and just counseling each other and loving each other is something that happens in all the other groups as well. But what makes them distinct? And if you're saying that some of them are and some of them aren't, then the some that are not, what are they? I mean, are they anything at all?
They're really good people.
Okay, so what makes them even associated with this whole history then?
Because they're scared to death. Now, let me say a little bit more about, let me just say, I think Paul's piece in Romans 6 helps us think about that. So this is the resurrection in Romans 6. Look at Romans 6, 1 to 12. And there, Paul says that what the resurrection is mostly for us, he says, is it's Christ going down into the water of baptism with us and coming up. So he literally says that the best analogy he knows for what resurrection is going into the water and coming up risen. Read it. In other words, he says that's resurrection. He's not saying that's only resurrection, but it's his primary example. And
I'm okay with that, but that's a Christ story. That's a story that unites them and everybody else. That's part of that. These extended, little communities around the Mediterranean world, right? It's
a Christ story. Of course, yeah. But you would need it to be. You would want to move it to a kind of a religious character, right? So that they would know that that's who they are.
In a way, yes, but it's not so much like I believe this and you don't, so that it's exclusionary. It's more I'm looking for a profound element. And yes, love and community and safety in a group is very profound. But I guess I'm looking for something, and maybe I shouldn't be, I'm just learning as I go here, but I'm looking for something that's a little bit less. So often when you are fighting and standing up to something and you're afraid, there has to be something that's bigger than yourself, even bigger than the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That actually is palpable in the community.
Yeah, and I would say another way to underline what you're saying there is, so the teachings of Jesus are mainly about what's called the reign of God. Or the realm of God, or the kingdom of God. And those are, when Jesus says, what's that like? He tells regular old stories with regular old people doing their work. And that's what the realm of God is like, is in the middle of that. That's what Jesus is talking about. So I would, in other words, Jesus is talking about God, and God as a person who's right in the middle of the scary mess. And that's almost over and over again. You find Jesus talking about the day-to-day life and talking about it, saying God is present with you. And the things that God is present with you about in the teachings of Jesus is simply day-to-day stuff.
But it's symbolic of something more profound, clearly.
Tell me more.
He's speaking day stuff, and I love that about him, but it's symbolic, or it's a metaphor for the actual presence of the divine in their midst that saves and helps and, takes care of them.
I think so, but I think that the dangers he's in all the time and his friends are in all the time are simply pretty different than the way our lives are put together. And so I don't want to take anything away from what you're saying. I'm wanting to say this is their daily life. And why that was so profound is a lot of people simply fell apart, got killed, went into terror. So in other words, the thing about this is that when Jesus and others talk about the resurrection, they talk about it in a whole bunch of different ways. And yes, all that put together can be right where you are, but we probably would know it better if we had to face resurrectionally the way they did.
Thank you. I don't want to occupy the.
No, it's
a great discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really. Hal, I want to mention that Ellie has added a great contribution to the chat here. I don't know that we have time to read all of it, but I really want to make sure that everybody does take a look at the chat and read what Ellie said here. Her main point is that she thinks it might be helpful for us to think about the chronological order of the resurrection stories and how they evolve beyond Jesus's time through this period. And I think she's making a helpful point there that people might want to be sure to look at.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there she is.
Pick up, Ellie.
Yeah, and you got lots of things to read from Ellie, so that
It's very helpful. I'll
that's
leave it
also
at that
wonderful.
to read it afterwards too. I think it's helpful to read that. Thank you, Ellie.
I think that one of the other things that is clear about what we found ourselves looking at as the book came together was this desperation for holding on to somebody, holding on to small groups. And one of the main things that we noted was how so many families were falling apart because of all the rough times that they were living in. So in other words, what we did in our second week was we noticed that hundreds of thousands of people, when Rome came through, they got taken slaves to be enslaved. And there, one of the main things that when they're in these small groups, they are very clear, slave and free, we're all in this together. And so it's clear we have all kinds of things we've found on rocks that said, well, the president of this Christ group was a slave. And so, in other words, there's so many levels of kids being taken away, of other people being made enslaved, and this is why these groups, these associations, these clubs and schools, why they needed so much to see each other so often. Well, one of the things that the last chapter does is talk about salvation. And I'd love to repeat what that part of our work was about, because in the First Testament, in the Hebrew people part of the Bible, there the word salvation is used over and over for the same thing over and over, and that is because Israel is so small as a country, they're always getting beat up by some empire. And so every time that God gives salvation to the people of Israel, it's mostly when they're in the middle of one of these terrible things of somebody coming in from outside and beating up on Israel. What's so fascinating to us is that since Rome was the worst ever in the Mediterranean for beating up on everybody, no wonder what Paul and other writers have to say is that salvation is being offered to you. And what you can see in all of these, whether it's the woman with the flow of blood or someone else whose daughter is about ready to die, all of those people are right on the edge of being able to survive. And so what salvation is in the New Testament, it's always used in the plural. And salvation is available to people who are just barely or not surviving. And that's what happens over and over again in these small groups, is salvation comes to us here. And again, I would encourage folks not to say this is ruling out God. That's a special way of how God is available to these kind of people.
How are you going to wrap this up in 5 minutes, Hal?
Well, you know, we'll have to have 22 more meetings, huh? So, no, this is, I guess I would say one thing that I don't want to, it feels like that later Christianity wasn't in as much trouble as we are. Or as they were, excuse me, as they were. And so there is some very, it's funny, when I was a boy in Bible study territory, I didn't realize how so many of the stories are scary.
Yeah.
That's because I, in my situation as a 1950s kid, my life wasn't scary like this. And so I did not understand the character of the New Testament till quite a bit later. That's one of the things. So a couple of you all were noticing this seems really different than the way we live life, and I think that's probably true. The question would be, what do we make of those differences? One of the interesting things that we see in the New Testament is one of the things we discovered as we were working is that since the New Testament itself didn't come into existence for another couple hundred years, these were all stories told by a friend of yours, or told by one group or one part of the group or the other group. And that turns out to be, I don't know how you are, but if somebody tells me a story rather than me having to read it, often there's a whole vibe of being together that is powerful in terms of how we are affected by stories. That is, if somebody really sits down and we all tell stories with one another about what is going on in our lives.
That's why we need to have stories with you, Hal.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many other topics to bring up. I mean, you've touched on the way people belong to Israel instead of just people being blood related. You've touched on the way people came together in communities and clubs or for different reasons, and you touched on the kind of feelings that people had. One thing I don't think we've talked, somebody mentioned in the chat here was there a place for the Hebrew God in all this compared to the Roman gods, or did that matter to them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really important, and it's clear that made a huge difference because the most of those Roman gods were not saying, if you and your people are getting beat up, I'm on your side. That was the way those gods come about is quite different.
I think we're also still wrapping our minds around the fact that these people following the Hebrew God are still Jews. There weren't any Christians yet. That still takes a lot of reprocessing to come to that conclusion that we're talking about people of the Hebrew text, people of the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew God, and that they're looking at things from the perspective of Jesus and his teachings.
Yeah, and the other thing, of course, is that since Israel has been beaten up for most of its 1,000 years, no wonder Jesus gets that kind of God, and gets the fact that it's worse than it ever was. But the people of Israel were always asking, God, where are you? Because we need you.
Yeah. So Hal, I hate to break it to you, but it's on the hour here already. I know
No,
that.
thank you all for this. This was by far, from my point of view, the best thing we've had in it, and I'm glad for your presence.
It's been
Yeah, thank you, Hal.
You're welcome, Helen. It's
very
great to see you
important.
again.
Very, very rich for all of us. Do you want to give us a 15-second preview for next month?
Yeah, sure. Next month, we're going to do 2 texts on resurrection, Paul from 1 Corinthians 15, and the treatise of the resurrection from the Nag Hammadi collection. So both of them actually are very, very close to each other, but most of us won't know one or the other.
And so then this will be right before Easter, so it'll be good preparation for us for getting into the Easter season. So thank you so much for waking us up and making us think about all this in a very deep and important way, Hal. So appreciate that. I'm going to close it out, but I hope the rest of you keep talking. I want to remind you that this discussion can continue to take place on the Early Christian Text Facebook conversation page. Please go there and keep on talking because it's helpful for all of us. And meanwhile, I'll see you next month. So I want to thank everybody too, just as Hal has done, for your participation. This was the February 2022 textual study on the Bible and Beyond discussion on the conclusions of the book After Jesus, Before Christianity, led by Dr. Hal Taussig. Once a month at 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights, generally the 4th of the month, we provide a discussion of some early Christian writings. Dr. Hal Taussig leads these sessions, sharing a well-framed overview of the topic and allowing participants time to ask questions and share their insights. So just to make sure you know, we do rely on your donations to be able to produce these textual studies. So if you're able, we especially appreciate a monthly pledge of support via Patreon. If you're not a member yet, please go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to make a pledge that's just right for you. PayPal or a check is also an option if you prefer. Check the website, earlychristiantext.com, for details. All I can say is thank you so much for being with us. You've enriched all of us by your presence and by your thoughts and your questions. We so look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.